all ready? Wow, that's loud. I see a lot of familiar faces from this morning, so I'm going to talk a little bit different tonight than what I did earlier today. We focused on how I got involved in citizen science earlier and what that meant for my life and the changing of my life. Water has become my life. And from that, I've learned a lot of different things. I know a lot about water. I never knew the effects of lead and lead poisoning. My family suffered from a lot of health issues from what's happened in our community, as well as other families. One of the reasons why my family fought so hard is my house in all the scientific papers is considered at ground zero. I have the highest lead anyone's ever seen. To talk about the way the cheating that happened that's not illegal that we're fighting to change. When the city of Flint in the state of Michigan did our testing, they use loopholes that are not illegal to hide lead to minimize the number so they don't have to say there's a problem. And so to give you a better understanding, the EPA, their maximum is 15 parts per billion. My first test with the city was at 104. And my second test was at 397. And then there's a third test that I found out about through a FOIA. Do you guys know what a FOIA is? Okay, FOIA is where it's called the Freedom of Information Act, where you can put a request in to get people's emails and documents. And so one was put in, and there was a third test that we were not aware that was done at our house that came back at 707. So when I went and found the professor from Virginia Tech, Mark Edwards, when I did my testing with him, my average test number was 2,500 parts per billion, and my highest was 13,200. Hazardous waste is 5,000. So that gives you a really good snapshot on what these cheating methods can do. And luckily, luckily our water was water that was discolored, where it was brown and yellow in different shades. So we had a warning sign, but there were homes in the city that didn't have that warning sign, where their water never changed color. And so a lot of those people didn't hear us at first. So my family drank it for quite a while. And from that, we've had to deal with the health issues. The health issues started out in the beginning with hair loss and rashes. And it takes up to 10 years to see the full effect of lead. And so in my children, who were 3 when this started, who are now going to be 8 next month, they've had more health issues come to light as this goes forward, which is concerning to us because there are babies. And when you're talking with the experts from the state, nurses, people in the medical profession, about the different things that are happening, and you're being told, you need to calm down, it's just a few IQ points, it's not the end of the world when it comes to your child, no parent should ever be told that from a medical standpoint, because it all matters. So being in the position that we are, going forward, what I want people to take away from our story and with my family is that we're going to be survivors of this. We're not going to be victims of this. And I think that's something that needs to be focused on as you're doing citizen science work, whether it be a water issue or an air issue, is that you have to have the strength to endure what you're going through and then the aftermath of it as you go forward with this, because it takes a lot out of you. One of the things I learned about doing citizen science work and working in different groups or in the group that you're associated with, the one thing I wasn't aware of would be where you're all working together for a common goal. I like to work with what I call what are truth seekers, people who rely on the truth, and science is what got us to where we are. So to me, I'm going to follow the science. I may not always like what the science has to say, but I'm going to follow it. But when you start working in these groups, I wasn't prepared for people fighting in the group and not agreeing to stay with the science and wanting to not put out there that things are getting better because they don't want to lose the publicity and where we are. Are there still problems in our area? Absolutely. Are we still working for them? Yes. Are we still fighting to get the laws changed? Yes. But to say Flint hasn't improved would be wrong, because we have made strides there. We've gotten some of the lead service lines out. We've gotten the lead numbers down. But there are other aspects to this. A lot of people don't know that we had a problem with bacteria in our water. And we had many people die, and many people get sick because of that. And so one of the new projects that I've been working on is chlorine testing. There's a group of us residents who go out and test where the city's testing, and our numbers aren't matching. Here we are going on 5 years, and they're still doing things where they can hide and cheat in these testings and not test the water the way people are drinking it, because we're getting such resistance on getting the laws changed. And that's one of the things that is tiresome, because these are things that aren't supposed to, these are people who are paid to protect you, and they're not doing their job. But it also shows the resilience that we've had as a community to keep fighting back and keep finding these areas where there are flaws in our system that need to be changed. And in order to get that done, I mean, it's going to take everybody. Water has become the new gold. And it's going to take everybody, not just the US, every community, to stand up and say that that's not okay, that water is a human right. We need that narrative to change so that going forward, people can have access to clean, affordable water. I don't know where I am on time. Good? Okay.
Yes, so I think you're asking me some questions.
So, in the work that you do in social justice, what has been your passion there? What project do you hold close to your heart that means the most to you?
Yes. I think the projects are not very far away from what you were describing, which are broadly related to questions of urban environmental justice. So I look in cities around the world, in the global north and the global south, how do residents who are residents of color, immigrants, low-income residents, how do they get more exposed than others to environmental toxics, to contamination, to climate risks than more privileged social and racial groups? And I also look at the fact that those same vulnerable residents or marginalized residents don't have access to the same level of climate protection, green infrastructure to protect them from climate impacts, green space, fresh food, fresh and affordable food, or also healthy housing in comparison with others. So I try to describe patterns of who is more affected by what, where. So for instance, in Spain right now, we're looking at the fact that residents in the old town of Barcelona are more exposed to poor housing, have less access to green space. There's also greater insecurity, higher exposure to drug traffic, for instance, in comparison with other neighborhoods, and we're trying to understand the drivers of that. In the US, we look at the fact that many cities that are green are actually more and more becoming cities of green privilege, privilege for the rich, and many of them which are doing waterfront redevelopment, which are building a lot of parks and green infrastructure to protect them from flooding. Those become landscapes where only the very rich live, because there's also a lot of real estate speculation associated with building green infrastructure. So you have these huge towers of luxury housing built in the vicinity or in the proximity of these new, beautiful, climate-protected green spaces. And at the same time, Latino residents, for instance, in a neighborhood we're looking at in Boston, East Boston, are being displaced directly. So they are being displaced by climate impacts, but they're also being displaced by and affordability issues, and they have to move to communities that are going to be more impacted by climate change, more exposed to impacts, and will have less resilient infrastructure. So that's what we call green gentrification, and we are looking at the paradoxes, the contradictions. You know, you have green cities, but they are not equitable for everyone. And so we are trying to point at how and where is that situation.
Okay. With working with the different groups in social justice, have you had conflict within the groups, like on what the solution should be? Different people,
yeah.
different ideas?
I think that one of the main issues we are still seeing in some communities is that some residents are still pushing for green infrastructure to be built because they see it as an asset. And in other cases, residents are saying, no, don't do anything because any new type of green infrastructure is going to push us away. So again, going back to the situation in Boston, you have another neighborhood which is called Roxbury, a majority African-American, Cape Verdean, Latino community, where historically there have been a lot of community gardens built in open spaces, in vacant spaces, in spaces that were disinvested, that were vacant. And communities of colors have seen those spaces as spaces of safe haven, refuge for them, also healthy food access. But then now, wealthier residents and speculators and developers are coming in and said, look at this beautiful community garden. We are now going to build a luxury housing next to it. Or more informally, residents come in from more privileged backgrounds, buy a condo or buy a building, flip it, and then live in it, and the property taxes starts to increase because the building has improved its quality. So some residents see that, oh my God, okay, the community gardens we used to have is now not for us anymore, so the community garden is displacing us. It's being kind of used for the profit of others, so let's not build anymore. And then there are others who are like, yes, but we need access to healthy food, we need access to a green space, so this community garden is still a place for us. We don't want to abandon it to speculators, to developers. So I think you have some tensions there.
Okay.
Still, you know, do we try to fight for green goods, or do we consider that those are going to displace us because they're going to be speculated upon?
Do you think putting policy changes in place to protect what they are doing, do you think that's what's needed to make them to want to continue to do it?
I think it's interesting because gentrification oftentimes gets the equivalent of displacement and unaffordability of a neighborhood, which is true. So many policy responses have to do with new units of affordable housing or public housing, what is called inclusionary zoning, meaning if you are going to put a new building in place, maybe 20 or 30% of the units should be reserved for social housing. Rent control, you also have community land trust, which is a form of trust, or which is a form of land control in which community members decide on this plot of land what is going to be built, by whom, for which price, etc. So there are different ways in which to create affordability of housing, and I think that's one tool. But many people also forget that gentrification also a feeling of erasure, cultural displacement, kind of social appropriation of a neighborhood. And so in the community gardens I'm talking about, the residents are like, okay, we're not yet maybe displaced by affordability issues, but residents from other backgrounds, so college-educated residents, students, kind of wealthy people, come in and farm our garden. So, or they are here trying to take advantage or tell us how we should do things. So they feel that there's a form of paternalism imposed upon them about what they should do with the space. So they feel culturally displaced. Or others are like, we used to have this playground to play in, or this basketball court, or this soccer field. And now there are these gentrifiers coming in, telling us what we should do, or looking at us in a weird way. So people feel culturally displaced. So I think that in those cases, the response is more, how do we organize residents so that they feel they can also push back against new practices being imposed against them or upon them? So say in the community gardens, it might also have to do with the fact that cities can give a little bit more financial support or technical support so that if gardeners cannot come to the space every day because they have to work 3 jobs, well, the space can still be maintained without gentrifiers taking it over, for instance. Or in the sports grounds or playgrounds, it might have to be with organizing after-school activities by community organizations from the neighborhood for long-term residents who will then take kids, well, you know, Latinos, African Americans, and others, and and make them feel that they own the space rather than them being pushed away by gentrifiers. So I think it both has to do with affordability issues and protecting people so that they can afford high prices, but it's also making sure that those spaces remain to residents, so that it's a question more of use and protection of uses.
So do you think there's any kind of scenario where they could work together to take the ideas, not being forced into it, but find a common ground so that they can work together in the gardens?
So I think I'm also not trying, I mean, it's an important question, because I'm not trying to portray, white and black and gentrifiers against gentrifying people, I think, or gentrified people, because I think that in many cases you also see alliances. Like gentrifiers can also actually be, in many places around the world, residents who have an education, who have a little bit more means, and they are only looking for a place to live because they've been displaced from a previous neighborhood. And so in many cases, what in academia we call kind of social preservationists are those types of gentrifiers who come in and are interested in making the neighborhood or preserving the social fabric of the neighborhood, its affordability, having programs for youth, for the elderly, etc., so that the neighborhood remains kind of a place that's welcomable for everyone. So I think they actually, in many cases, work together to create a land trust, to give them financial access to new resources that help them network in the city. So those gentrifiers might have a financial, a technical, or a political power that residents can use in their favor. And I think we also see that in many cases in Barcelona, especially in the old town, where you have gentrifiers who can also push the agenda of the people who have been living there for a long time. And I would say that within what we know as super gentrification, which are cities that are so unaffordable that even the upper middle class or the middle class cannot live in there, you can't portray, it's not like two groups, gentrified versus gentrifiers. You also have multiple layers of who is being displaced. So I think that's also something to take into consideration, is not black and white. And in terms of the gardens, there are many gardens, for instance, so there are many green spaces where the technical support that might be given by a gentrifier has benefiting residents. It's also a question of taking the voices and the needs of those residents into consideration, rather than coming in and say, this is how you should do
That's what I mean, like finding that common ground to work together.
What's tricky is that a lot of the gentrifiers, or a lot of the more socially or economically powerful residents, have been associated historically with like the alternative food movement. So they are foodies, they like organic food, they are vegetarian, and they have an image associated with them which is linked to privilege. And then those are portrayed against the food justice people or the residents who are trying to just have access to any form of fresh food. So if you can kind of reconcile these two groups, and think more from a point of view of owning the city, owning a space for residents rather than speculation, making sure that people feel that gardens are spaces for everyone to find refuge, psychological peace, physical activity in, then I think the alliance is more likely to go forward.
What made you get into this line of work? Why did you want to be in social justice?
My background is originally in international development, and I was looking at, or let's say, I was just very inspired at the same time, very repelled by the fact that racism, colonialism, neocolonialism, capitalism, all of this together come in play to exploit both natural resources and people, with different types of impacts, which can be resource extraction, like oil and mining in indigenous communities, which can be oil refineries in the middle of a residential area in Houston, in Texas, which can also be gentrification and the way in which people of color are being erased from their neighborhood by luxury housing. So for me, it was always this relationship of just being repelled, but just being shocked in a way and being mad and trying to think about the way in which we in our research can help uncover inequities, new types of inequities, and try to think through what policies can protect people, both from contamination and protect them from climate risks, and also make them benefit from green infrastructures.
Are you seeing more green infrastructures from when you started this work going forward? Are you seeing more of the green infrastructures?
Yeah, we are seeing a lot of cities now that we call are in the kind of the green bandwagon. There is a form also of neoliberalism, or green is exploitable by private interest, by industries, by developers, by banks. There are now even systems that are called the green bonds, financial tools, so that cities can get their green space financed by international investors. So then cities know that green sells. And again, it can be green of anything. It can be a new park. It can be a greenway, a rail-to-trail park. It can be climate infrastructure. It can be anything that, in a way, is associated with bringing nature back in the city. So I think there are a lot of investments from the city, a lot of investment from private investors to make cities greener in many different ways.
All right, so in Flint, we have the Superfund sites. Have you seen where they've been using green to cover up where there's been toxins in the ground?
I think in New York, through the BOA program, the Brownfield Opportunity Program, which is the redevelopment of contaminated sites all over New York State, but in New York City in particular, you've seen brownfields being covered up in Brooklyn, I think in Greenpoint, by green space and at the same time luxury housing. The cleanup is still taking place, but sometimes it's not thorough enough. So you have this green image without having deep environmental remediation. Or the Gowanus Canal in New York as well. The canal is still massively contaminated. It used to be an industrial canal, a shipyard area. And it's still being cleaned up. It's a deep Superfund site with a lot of contamination. But then you have a Whole Foods, which is a very expensive supermarket chain in the US, together with new parks created right next to a contaminated area.
Our time is up. I don't think we have time for any more, do we?
Yeah.
What do you hope going forward? What do you hope to see with the work that you're doing? Really quickly.
I think we are hoping that cities, which are doing a lot of green and sustainability work, will also put inclusion and equity at the center of their practice. And we'll consider that greening is not a specialty from the green space or the environmental preservation department, but needs to be thought out in a territorial way and in a comprehensive way so that it doesn't become an exclusive environmental privilege.
Okay.
I was trying to be short.
Thank you very much.
All right. Voila, that's yours. You rotate a bit. All right. So I jump right in. Yes. Hello, Louise. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So can you describe to us a bit, why do you believe in the power of maps? You can maybe tell us a bit about why you came to work with maps and what's your trajectory with maps.
Okay, well, I kind of have a bit of a checkered history in terms of my life story and using maps. Originally, my kind of academic domain started within evolutionary genetics and mapping the distribution of evolutionary genetics, but from a conservation perspective. And I mean, I think traditionally when people think about conservation, it's let's go to Africa, let's go to the Amazon, and let's make this a reserve. Okay, and saying, okay, let's map out this reserve without actually realizing that there's people that have been living in these so-called reserves for a long time. So then I kind of moved from mapping genetic distribution to actually looking at people and places and using maps as a way for them to actually kind of share and communicate their local experience, their knowledge. So really using maps as a tool for communication to understand what's happening in a place. And maps have traditionally kind of been used as a tool of power, and there's a certain kind of power relationship in using maps. We look at the global view, and most people will see a map with Africa the same size as South America. That's not true. They'll look at, okay, we have the north and the south, but there's nothing to say that the south couldn't be in the north and Australia wouldn't be at the bottom. So it's about, okay, how we see the world and how we see the place. But there are different ways of seeing what's happening in a place, and maps are a really kind of powerful communication tool, much more than a table, much more than a report. So that's kind of how I started working with maps and using alternative maps and alternative ways of seeing to try to understand what's happening in cities or other communities, and then using that as a starting point to open up discussion and look for, okay, this is what's happening, but what is it that we want to see happen in this place or space? So that's kind of how I ended up mapping.
Can you give us maybe an example of a powerful map that you've been involved in or led, let's say in one place in the global north and in one place in the global south, maybe cities?
I
Just
guess
to contrast them a bit.
Yeah, much of our, let's say the majority of my work has been in the global north, although I have colleagues that have done a lot of work in Africa, and actually we have a project now starting in Kampala, Uganda. So I'll give an example, let's say maybe in the north, where we've used mapping and working with communities to visualize what it is that they've been trying to say for a long time. We were working in a community in South London, in a fairly kind of deprived community, where they had a problem with a scrapyard. So this is a scrapyard that kind of breaks down vehicles and beats them up and makes scrap metal. It's recycling, it's a good thing, no problem. But they'd been kind of complaining with the municipality that this, this is causing it's a noise issue. There's machinery. Somebody phones up, they get on the line, speak to somebody in the public administration, say, they're at it again. They put the phone down. Okay, it's just like this black box. Who knows how many calls? Who knows who's been calling? Nothing happened. So we started working with this community and say, okay, you want to map noise. Now, there are noise maps that exist. The Environment Agency creates noise maps which show the kind of noise that people are experiencing across the whole of the UK. But again, these noise maps did not represent people's day-to-day lived experiences. They're models. So it's simulating, looking at, okay, traffic noise. But when you live in a community, you have the traffic, you have your neighbor's dog, you have the boy who's playing trap music upstairs on the second floor. It's cumulative, so the experience that we get, but the data and the maps that are generated by, let's say, the officials don't show that kind of cumulative effect. So we said, okay, how can we design a scientific methodology for you to collect data about the noise that you're experiencing in this community? So we gave them sound meters. We said, okay, follow this protocol. You take a noise measurement. Don't just wait to hear the banging, okay, because this is not then going to be a representative sample, but take kind of noise measurements at intervals. So we did that in that community, and they created their own noise map, which is quite different to, let's say, the official map that was showing noise in that area. And then they held a community meeting. It was probably the one that was attended by the largest number of members in the community ever. The Environment Agency came, the local authority came, and they said, look, this is what we've been trying to say for the last 8 years. And basically, they had a visualization which showed the, let's say, decibel levels, and we averaged them out, again, to not be biased, to say, okay, this is our reality. And for the first time, the local authority said, okay, we can't deny, we can't dismiss this as anecdotal. Or it's not kind of gone into this black box of registered John Smith phoned again on Friday. It was a very visual and open and transparent, let's say, medium. Of course, they said, okay, we can't trust this data. It's been collected by citizens. It's not being done by professionals. But what they actually did is they went out and commissioned a noise survey to be done by acousticians and so forth, which was a good thing. Non-surprisingly to us, the results from the professionals said the same thing. But the upshot of that was the Environment Agency actually revoked the license because it was actually a kind of environmental nuisance. So for us, that was a real kind of a positive outcome of something that was basically invisible, but the community were being affected. And by them kind of collectively working together and creating an alternative to, let's say, the maps that were being used previously, and then saying, okay, this is what we've been trying to say, but you've not listened. Here it is. And actually having some positive kind of impact at the end. So I think that was one of the, let's say, success stories in terms of kind of this process of participation, engaging communities and other stakeholders like the local authority and the Environment Agency. I mean, we're working now around air quality in a lot of communities in London. We collaborated with Josep in Barcelona to, again, use low-tech methods and ways in which people can participate in collecting information about air quality in a particular community. And I think the difference in the communities that we're working with in Uganda specifically is that life has so many more pressures in that, okay, people's time, people's resources, capacity. So in the Global South, in this particular scenario in terms of air quality, we're not working directly with the citizens because they're worried about putting food on the table, how they're even going to get books and take their kids to school. Air pollution is a major problem in terms of, let's say, public health. It's huge, but people have more pressing issues. But there's still the appetite and the need. So in this cases, we're working directly with the municipalities, and we're working with researchers, we're working with the Environment Agency because they don't have information. There are no maps. The maps don't exist because there's no data. So even you're kind of starting at a point which is like ground zero. So for us, it's about kind of who are the actors and what's the starting point to kind of look at where people are beginning this journey and how do we start a process to enable people to participate. And when we say people, it's not always just, let's say, the lay citizen. People, when we're living in an urban environment that's made up of the practitioners, the academics, the municipality, the policymakers, and so forth. So where are we starting in this journey? And kind of, let's say, flipping it or setting up a situation to enable you to start something where people are at.
You've answered a lot of the other follow-up questions I was going to ask, which is very interesting. You are able to very connect things very well together. One of the questions I was wondering is, technology has changed a lot. Tools to gather data and even communication has changed a lot, let's say, over the last 5 to 10 years. How has the work you do evolved, taking into consideration those technological, those communication changes, and in a way, what has improved, what has been made easier, and what's more challenging now?
I'm still a bit of a Luddite. I work with technology every day. We have a platform, we have mobile apps, but I'm still a bit of a Luddite. And for me, this is technology. This is technology. And I think there's this assumption that when we say technology, it's got to be digital. It's got to be an app or a computer or, So these are all technologies, and I think, of course, yeah, we are moving to utilize digital much more, both in terms of gathering and collating local knowledge and encouraging participation or new forms of participation using digital technology. But I'm also very aware that if we push so far this direction, we still lose people, because this assumption that everybody has a mobile phone and everybody can do this, and mobile phones are ubiquitous. I read so many papers about, technology, smart computing, and blah, 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 where they're talking, but the reality is it's not actually the case. People may have a phone, but, my dad has still got one of these analog phones with the buttons this size. So, he may use technology for his purpose and appropriate it according to his needs. So I think we need to be mindful of that and go with the flow in terms of being able to utilize the new tools that are coming out, but not push it to a boundary whereby we also leave people behind. And I think in the research that we do and the work that we do as practitioners, we always need to be able to try to straddle these two domains. So guys that we collaborate with or partners that we work with who do a lot of work in the Congo Basin, they're using technology. Now they're using technology with pygmy hunter-gatherers, you know, in Cameroon and the Congo Basin, who can navigate, I mean, I'm all about mapping and navigation, can navigate through the rainforest and literally can give you a vision. You go and you take that mango tree, and when you get to that mango tree, so they can map out the whole, you know, of a ecosystem visually. But they don't understand this representation of their place in 2D. So you're showing them a 2D, you know, aerial vision of their space. It's a whole different way of, like, let's say, spatial literacy. So you're introducing technology. Okay, if it can enable them, and in that case, they're looking at kind of illegal hunter-gathering and illegal logging. But it's how can we, let's say, appropriate technology to facilitate and enable, but reduce the barriers in terms of using the technology. So in those cases, we're working with people who are non-literate. So applications are using pictorials and icons as a way to collect information and share information. And those icons are not representative of what we think a mango tree would look like. You know, I'm not a very good drawer. So in terms of the co-designing of the application itself, is sitting down with, okay, what are the resources that are relevant for you in your space? How would you represent them using imagery? So it's all about that. And then, again, great, we can use the technology and create, let's say, maps for them to actually take to the table and say, all right, we're dealing with the illegal logging company, we're dealing with all of these different stakeholders, now we're kind of putting our mark on the map. So we do use technology, but I always start with pen and paper, honestly. I go with a map, put it on the table, give you a pencil, give you a pen, give you a red color sticky or a yellow color sticky and say, okay, let's start there. And then say, okay, well, we've got this really nice platform where we're going to put what you've contributed so that it can be shared with others that were not here today, who didn't have the time, but they can see what it is that you've said, and also kind of share with others so it can kind of disseminate. But that doesn't then exclude you who wants to come to that meeting, even just to have that social interaction.
No, it's very powerful, really what you are describing, social mapping and empowering mapping and inclusive mapping in that sense. So I think it's a very important tool also for decision makers, and I would say also for scientists. Do I have time to ask one more question? One more question. So what do you think has been the impact, or what is the potential impact of this mapping work on building new science or changing the way in which science is performed? What have you seen out there as your main impact, would you say, or potential?
I mean, maybe not, I wouldn't maybe narrow it down to mapping specifically. I think, you know, one of the, let's say, one of the issues with the, let's say, the traditional model is we get research funding, it's for 3 years. We have PhD students that then go and do their PhD, which takes 4, 5, 6, depending on how good they are, years. Then they publish. And then, you know, this then becomes, okay, new findings, new scientific evidence. That evidence then is used by policymakers to inform policy. So that's the kind of traditional cycle. So there's that in terms of how science informs policy and then how policies are made. It's quite a long cycle. Then you've also got the political cycle, which is quite short. 4 years, we want to be elected. What's the popular? They all want this. So that's going to be the remit. So let's forget the science here. It's like, okay, I want to get re-elected. Let's do Brexit. Put Brexit into the manifesto, and you know, it can be disastrous. because they're working along that kind of 4-year political cycle. And I think, like, a lot of the work that we do around citizen science participation shortens that cycle, because it's like, okay, a community comes to me and say, you know what, we've got a problem. Can you help us be able to, let's say, collect evidence, use that evidence to inform, engage all of the stakeholders, and then try to take action. This is something that, in, let's say, the best cases, can happen within a year, 2 years, if you've got people sitting around the table. That doesn't normally happen with the traditional scientific cycle, policy-making cycle, etc. So I think for me, it's like the ability to kind of speed up this process, because people want to see things happen now, you know? And people are impacted now, every day. So it's like, do we need to wait for this peer-reviewed paper, or do we need to wait for the elections that are coming up, and then they promise and then they disappoint? So I think that that's probably one of the kind of positives.
The acceleration
Yeah.
capacity. All right. Thank you.
Okay.
I leave.
Hi, okay. Well, I was actually going to start by maybe saying, could you just introduce yourself to the audience and say, you know, who you are?
Okay. My name is Miriam. I'm described there as an activist and a spokesperson for the Ibn Battuta Foundation, which I am. But I'm also, yeah, it's there. I'm a communications consultant at an agency at Civilare. We work with communications and data to try to help companies, private companies or public institutions or any institution in general, to know more about their audiences, citizens, customers, potential customers, and just know better how to address them. So that's what I do.
So when you're working, let's say, with the public sector, the municipalities, in kind of assisting them and developing their communication with their populace, I mean, what are the kind of key factors and aspects that you encourage them to do, and the benefits of using, let's say, digital as a form of communication?
Yeah, basically we know that there's a lot of institutions that could do better when it comes to digital and getting to citizens. And you were talking about how sometimes they only think in 4-year terms, and it happens here a lot. And sometimes in 4 years you don't really get to see the results, so we have to explain why that's important, why a change is important, why a new website, something as simple as that, why a new website is needed, why they need to focus on what people are saying in social media, what their demands are, and why that's important. And that's really sometimes a challenge. And we see that now in 3 months, in 3 or 4 months, there's local elections here in Catalonia. And there's a difference that we see from our company, and that's one thing is political parties and how you use social media and digital communication, and a different thing is public institutions. But for some people, that's kind of mixed up. They don't really see the difference, and it makes it sometimes hard to work.
So in terms of the, let's say, public sector or the municipalities, is there, let's say, an aversion to kind of using social media as a let's say, opening up and a platform for discourse?
A lot. Sometimes we've had people tell us we're not on Twitter and we won't be because we don't want complaints published on our pages. And that's like, okay, if you think that they may be published, it means that they are there, so it's better if you know them. And sometimes it feels like local governments just want to be in their own buildings and maybe not know about what's going on out there. And we try to tell them that this is a way of communicating, but also listening to your citizens. So it should be like a conversation that never stops. Here in Catalonia, we've had plans municipals de participació, like different plans carried on by different local governments where they ask people to collaborate and to say what they wanted, be it related to youth, to sports, to the elderly, to housing, different issues that each city had. And that's a really nice thing, and it should be there, but that only happens every like 2-3 years. Maybe if there's an election coming, it may be faster, but the thing is that that's not always there, while digital communications is always there. The way we see it, it's a way to open up the city hall to everyone and be able to listen to what everyone has to say in a good way, meaning that you can improve, that you can know what you're not doing right, meaning that you can also know what you are doing right, and that's kind of a challenge, having that fear out of the public institutions, because like some people don't go to the doctor because they say, if I go, he will tell me that I'm actually sick, so I'd rather not. That's kind of what happens. And from the citizen's point of view, it's also, with this whole debate on privacy and everything, it's also a challenge, because the way I see it, if I'm mad at something because I don't like how the street, I don't know, the street is dirty, so I go and tweet about it. I want my city hall to read it. I want them to know about it and act based on that. But to some people, that's kind of invading their privacy, like knowing that the local government or even the state government may be looking at what you are posting publicly, actually, is sometimes a challenge. Like sometimes it's how do we explain citizens that this social media listening or this whole opening up is actually to be better at our work, and that's also a challenge. So it's working with both ways.
So do you find in your work, let's say, as somebody that utilizes social media both professionally and as a citizen kind of living in Barcelona, that there are certain, let's say, profiles or groups of people that are, let's say, really loud? When I say loud, I mean present, and others that you know exist and you know are there, but are not present.
Yeah, I have two examples on that. One of them is not, the client was not a public institution, it was a private company, but it was affected by a political debate that was going on here in Catalonia. I don't know if you know about the situation here in Catalonia, but there's kind of a debate going on, and there's different positions on that debate. So some companies have suffered from boycott callings from different users, and one company in particular, or at least one company that we know about, was worried about it, about reading way too many tweets or comments related to you're in Barcelona, so I will not consume your products anymore. I will not be buying your products until you leave Catalonia. So they were kind of worried, and we just thought, okay, that's really loud, and it looks like there's a lot of people talking about you, but let's look at it in a different way. So we mapped the conversation with digital. I don't know if you could hear me because it keeps, yeah? Okay, thanks. I speak too fast sometimes, so I'm sorry about that. We mapped the conversation. So we had different topics that were covered in this conversation about this brand. Let's call it La Bonne. And some people were just having the normal conversation. I will eat this product tonight. I will buy this product tomorrow. And some were really negative about it. So we tried to kind of be able to look at an image and then know how the groups were talking to each other. Let's say how the conversations were going on. Because we always say that Twitter especially, it's like a local bar. So everyone goes there and everyone is sharing their opinion and everyone thinks that they know more than the other. But we wanted to know if in that local bar the conversations were all mixed up or it was different groups, and it was actually different groups. And the group that was the loudest was actually quite small and far from the conversation. So later on we knew that it was actually promoted by some specific digital news. And yeah, I mean, if you live in Spain and know about the reality, you probably know what type of media would promote this type of conversation. But that was what's going on, and we mapped it just to know how these conversations were working, and what was the organic conversation and what was actually an organized conversation that was just aimed at scaring the company. And I had another case that I forgot about just speaking. So yeah, in this sense, we mapped out the conversation, and that was really interesting. And 2 or 3 years ago, there was general election here in Spain. So we tried to know if by looking at the conversation in social media, we could know about the results on voting day. We also did that on Brexit. And
Are you right?
Yes. Yes, but that was more complex than the one we carried on in the national one. Yeah, unfortunately we were. So when we were looking at the potential voters of each political party, we knew that some of them were louder than the others, so we had a group of people who know about human interaction and psychology and sociology and all of that stuff. And they were analyzing how each potential voter of each political party would act on social media, depending also on the average age of people who would vote, whether they were more more open to be on Twitter or not. And so, yeah, we always have to, like, social media is there, and there's a lot that you can get from it, but you cannot just jump into it and be like, okay, this is the conversation, and that's what I know about the world. You have to actually do some research behind it and have a team that will actually look at it from different perspectives. So.
Have you kind of seen any evidence, let's say, in the work that you're doing in Barcelona, where social media has kind of had a positive impact in kind of people getting a collective and mobilizing to actually do something?
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's really nice, and it happens all the time. And here in Barcelona, there's a lot of social justice movements against racism, feminist movements. There's a lot going on, and a lot of times it's mobilized through social media, and especially Instagram. And that may sound like we're always saying how young people are disconnected from reality. They only care about posting pictures in social media, but we don't really look at what they are actually posting. And a lot of times they are posting things related to social movements, to organizing a demonstration, to sharing a story that they believe is unfair. So that goes on and that happens, and a lot of activists know each other from social media. And that's a resource that we didn't have a few years ago. And I think that a lot of times people look down on social media as if it was just some superficial tool that just tries to take away our privacy, and we just waste time on that. But actually, there's a lot that we can do that we couldn't do a few years ago because we didn't have it. And it's happening now, and we've shown that it happened. We've seen it also in the Arab countries. We've seen it in the United States, for example. And so that's happening today, and it's just a matter of public institutions to actually recognize what's going on there and to actually give value to it and promote it. So I think it would be a lot easier to engage young people if we were more interested in using social media as a tool that could help us get to them, because they are already organizing themselves.
So I know that some of the work that you do is kind of linked to, let's say, migrants and people coming new to the city, new to Europe. Kind of in what way is social media kind of part of facilitating or enabling that kind of, let's say, information sharing, settlements?
In a way, it makes it easier, because it obviously makes it easier to have a voice, to get journalists get to you, to maybe if you see an ad that's completely racist, you can just say it, and maybe if you're lucky, it will be deleted, which didn't happen when the ads were on TV. You get to connect with a lot of young people, so you get to know about their stories, their fears. Sometimes if they trust you, they will tell you about what's going on in their life, and I think that's really, really beautiful, because it just brings you closer to a lot of people. But at the same time, it's obviously leaving some people behind, meaning that if everything is on social media or through a website, for example, at the foundation that I collaborate with, a lot of people that come during the day, they just come because they need to fill in a form that they can only fill online, and they don't have a computer at home. And that may sound really like, from our privilege, it may sound like if you don't have a computer, you can just ask for a friend. But when you are moving, when you don't know if you will stay in Barcelona for more than 6 months, when you have other concerns, obviously having a computer is not what you need, and you need a computer to fill in that form, and that's an important form that you need. So a lot of people that come to the foundation today come because they need access to some digital... Sometimes it's a form, sometimes it's something more complex, but they just need internet and to be able to understand it. And that's not only because it's digital, but also because of the way some things are explained. And it makes it sometimes hard, as much as I think everyone is trying, and I think that there's effort in that, and I think that governments are actually thinking about it, but still there's a lot of things that have been digitalized, and they should not be, because not everyone can follow it yet, and that's because there's inequality. It's not because people do not want to. So,
Yeah, I mean, you kind of answered the next question because it's similar to, I mean, in the London, I mean, in the UK, it's kind of moving to this digital by default, which is good to reduce time in terms of like form filling and bureaucracy. But yeah, it's how do you deal then with the almost like further marginalization of particular groups which are already marginalized?
Yeah, for example, here in Spain, if you are perceiving money from the government because you haven't had a job for a long time, you have to log in. I think it's each 3 months or a month, or maybe it depends on the case, and just log in your computer with a password, and then it's just a click or two, just to confirm that you're still in that situation. And to the foundation, a lot of people go just because they forgot about it, they didn't know that it was so important, they didn't know how to do it. A lot of things happen, and some would be solved easier than others. But still, this click means that some people will not get money the next month, and that brings a lot of problems with it. So yeah, digital is good, but we cannot forget about just looking broadly with everything. Just because a lot of times people making these decisions see it from their perspective, from working with these kind of technologies for a lot of years, from maybe when we see the simplest way, we're like, okay, that's a really good one because you've seen the complex and you've seen the other one. But maybe when you bring it to people, it's not that easy or that useful, or it doesn't really help them. So there's a challenge there, but I think we will overcome that. Yeah.
Are we?
It's 1 minute.
We have. So I guess kind of what would like your take-home like snippet be, or summation be in, okay, looking at the work that you're doing and active civic participation with communities which may not traditionally participate in this whole kind of decision-making cycle?
I don't know if I got your question right, but I think that it would be just the ones that have the privilege of having access to this type of ways of communicating to the local governments or the bureaucracy or whatever. We should be aware of that situation and know that there's a lot of people left behind, and things as simple as teaching the elderly how to use a computer. Like, that's really, really simple, but it's also very helpful. Teaching young people how they can help their parents with their computers, how they can use their social media to speak up for those who cannot. Like, that's really simple, but I think it could help, and it could also foster like a sense of community that sometimes we lack. And so I think it would be like a really cute project if we had different generations and different situations mixed up and just working together so that everyone brings together different ideas, and whoever has the possibility just sends them in whatever way they can. So, I don't know.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you. Right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hi. So, Sharon from Public Lab, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Shannon Dosmagan, and I'm from an organization called Public Laboratory for Open Technology and Science, the shorter version being Public Lab, and I'm coming from the United States.
Okay. There's a lot more here, though. Okay. One of the questions that I had while reading your bio and everything that I could find about you was, how is your day? Like, what do you do at Public Lab? What's a day like at Public Lab?
What's a day like at Public Lab? That's a great question. I don't know if I have a straightforward answer for that. I think that it's a mixture of a number of different responsibilities that range from thinking about the bigger picture of what's happening in the various fields that we work around, what's the future vision of our work in particular, where are the connections lying between others that are working on very similar things, and how can we better support each other, all the way to the more kind of logistical pieces of, responding to emails and
getting water,
doing budgets, and yeah, exactly.
Okay. Cool. How many people are working now at Public Lab?
On staff, we have, let's see, I think 9 people.
Okay.
Yep. So it's a small organization.
Well, just like mine.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like from all over the world, how many people are participating in it?
Sure. So we are an open source community, and we support people that are all over the world. And we probably could not give you a set number at any point, but I think right about now we say there's around 13,000 people that are somewhere out there that interface with Public Lab in some way or another.
So maybe you meet someone in the street and you're both in the same project, but you didn't know about it.
Exactly. I knew I was coming to Barcelona and that there were a few people that had talked to other Public Lab staff members and reached out to them. And
So did you get to meet them?
I hope so at some point or another.
Okay, cool. So what do you think the biggest challenges are for the next, let's say, 10 years?
In the world? Well,
that you could help with?
Yeah, that we can help with. I think that's a great question, and I always try to, I think people who work in social justice especially try to take on everything, the entire world.
It all intersects,
Yeah, and I try to pare mine down to the top 3 things that I can focus on. I think we, working in the United States, and this is probably similar for others who work on environment and environmental health, coming out of the current administration that we have, I think we're going to be in a deregulated mess. So that is going to be a personal focus of mine over the next however long it takes to hopefully build up some of our protections and laws in the future. I think that we are also in a very interesting space, not only in the US, but across the world, where movements are rising up and coming together, but also splitting in very unique ways that I think we're going to have to, as a collective global population, try to figure out. So we have very big tasks
really
coming up, or that we're working on now.
So how do you think open code can help with all of that?
Open
systems, what you work with?
So I'm a big proponent of open source, as is all of Public Lab. And I think the magic in thinking about open systems and the transparency that can come with them is that we're all part of the solution and we're all working towards similar goals and objectives. And at some point, we might fork off in another direction and we might, build another project from that, but the grounding is all in the same place. So the openness of our systems makes us a stronger community as we proceed with our work.
What was your first project as an open source project? Like, what did you work with first?
So it was actually during the BP oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico in 2010. So I had worked with accessible hardware technology prior to that, but I had not incorporated. That's okay. I had not incorporated open source to those projects. And so during the BP spill, we launched a version of Ushahidi, which was a crisis mapping platform. And it actually didn't work all that well. So my first use of open source showed me very clearly that for a mapping platform like Ushahidi to work, there had to be a very clear feedback loop, and there had to be clear response systems at all points. Very closely after using that system, we started Public Lab, and we were using balloons and kites with point-and-shoot cameras to launch into the air and take...
Like a drone?
Yeah, like a drone, but a very manual version, yeah. And that kind of DIY, almost analog technology applied with open source licensing is what led to the kind of bloom of Public Lab's work. So using just 3 open hardware tools, these 3 mapping kits, we were able to pass them across 4 of the Gulf Coast states, from Louisiana all the way over to the Panhandle of Florida, and collect something like 200,000 images while we were worked with about 250 people. And so for me, being able to do that kind of work in such an accessible manner really led to, I think, the foundation of how I look out at the world now.
Cool. Is it the project that you're the proudest of?
Maybe, but I think the Public Lab project is what I'm most proud of. The work that we started doing was very particular at the point that we were doing it at. And I was like 27 or 28 and had way too much energy and was able to stay up for 20 hours. I was able to stay up all night long, and we were like, all right, we're taking on the environmental movement because they're just like dull right now. We're going to disrupt the field of citizen science because it's all about top-down research, and we're going to combat the model of technology only being accessible to industry and government and research bodies. And we're going to do all that, and we're like 6 people with no money. So yeah, it was kind of the kickoff moment, and to see where we started and where we're at now is, I think that's what really like keeps me going.
How long have you been working with Public Lab? It was
almost 10 years now. Yeah.
10 years. And talking about money, do you think that private companies are needed in this whole process, or do you think that we can, just work without them? What do you think the role of private companies is in this whole process?
I think we all have a role in getting to the solution, but that some of us have a lot longer of a distance to getting there. I think working with private companies who have ethics that are grounded the same place as the communities that they might be working with is of utmost importance. And I also, have many times myself and in the work that we've encountered come up against private industry, especially oil and gas refining and other kind of extractive industries that are not ready to play a piece in the solution. So there's kind of a differing spectrum, I think.
So maybe with I don't know, thinking out loud now, but young people jumping into the labor market lately, maybe it's easier to get private companies, maybe run by them, involved in this whole, because at the end of the day, it's just a new mindset. So do you think that it might be easier?
Sorry, I think it's in your mindset. It's also in the money. So when a company that we may be interfacing with from the community angle is seeing that data that is being put forward about the company may mean that they have to pay a violation, or they have to update the technology on their facility. That's very, I think, impactful on how you interface with people. I do think the younger generations, as we think about like who are going to be the next leaders in the world, like it's incredibly crucial to be starting here and working with people in their teenage years to get them thinking strategically about how we live in this worldwide ecosystem that relies on good ethics and good choices that are community thinking and not individualistic.
Do you work with young people?
We do, actually. So Public Lab never saw ourselves as an education organization, but because of the nature of the technology that we have, which is very similar to how Luis was talking about, starting with a pen and paper, we cut soda bottles up so that we can make stabilizing rigs, which are actually quite high tech, but made out of a soda bottle. So the process of making and the process of creating is really, really attractive to younger audiences as well as teachers. So we just actually in the last couple of weeks have launched more formally our first education program that's going to be in the Gulf Coast region.
Okay. And how many students do you expect to impact with this?
I think to be determined. Yeah, to be determined, but because all of our work is open source, once we put resources and materials out into the world, I think that it's going to just kind of float, which is good. I think it'll be more work to reach teachers and to really think about the programs that are going to be most impactful for thinking about how teachers can transfer information amongst themselves. But challenges that are good to have.
And not about young people, but public in general and society in general. Do you think that they need more education regarding open source and regarding how to play a role in being a change?
Maybe not about open source explicitly, but I think what we lose as we get older is like society kind of dampens our innate curiosity that we have. So we start out in a place in the world that, you know, you want to touch everything and you want to, you know, cut things up and throw things in the air. And the older we get, the more we're told that's not appropriate. That's, you know, you need to use your indoor voice, those kind of things. So I think if we can build back in the process of just innate exploration and curiosity and creativity, and then those other things like, and open source could help you, you know, do more of that, that we're going to be in a really good place to, you know, think more proactively.
But being in a society that seems to be like going to individualism to a lot of people, but to social movements to some others, like what are your perspectives when you look at this whole situation?
Well, the U.S. is a, you know, capitalist society. It's an interesting balance because I think previously as well, uphold this notion of volunteerism. So you're in it for your individual self and your family, but at the same time you're, you know, expected to give back to the community in these various ways. And I feel like although capitalism may not be leaving, that younger generations, including my own, are starting to shift away from that like solely individualistic thinking to what is the community that I want to see happen. And a lot of that is because of the political moment that we're in, that's really calling us to with necessity create a very different future than what we're experiencing right now.
That's interesting. Like, do you feel that sometimes that just happens in your environment? Because in Spain, we don't have the climate that you have in the US. So, and we come from a few years that it was really hard to get to the labor market. So maybe it was easier to get involved in group movements. But when people access labor market, when they get a job for their own, when they start stabilizing their situation, it seems to be harder to get them to cooperate and just be open to think of ways in which we can all help each other. And that happens to people that maybe you thought you could work with for a lot of years, but just because they went to a different way of life, it just changed. So I don't know if that's something that you think may happen, even if you have this climate, if it gets better in that sense in the US. I don't know if there's a question that you've asked yourself.
Yeah, I think in the US, we take a lot of things for granted. I mean, we do. But at the same time, over the last couple years, we've seen a lot of the things that we take for granted and uphold as like our rights as citizens stripped away. Everything from healthcare to reproductive rights to our environmental health protections, and that motivates people. When they see things directly impacting their lives, it can be a very quick, you know, change in the way that we act.
And what do you expect to happen in the next? So I asked you about the challenges.
Yeah.
Now let's talk about the hope for the last minute. What do you think will actually improve?
Globally, or?
Yeah, globally. If you can globally, if not in the United States.
So, I don't have a ton of hope around climate change, but I'm gonna just concentrate on that one issue. In the setting that we're talking about right now, where we're talking about the combination of science and cities, and we just came out of this day-long citizen science conversation, I think we do have the opportunity to reach a lot more people that can constructively think about ways to change the current future. Because really, if we don't solve this massive global crisis that's, you know, at our doorstep, what are all the other crises that we're trying to solve? So I have hope, and I'm going to work as hard as I possibly can to make the changes necessary to address that one particular thing.
Okay. So thank you.
Thank you.
Time's up.
Hello.
Hello. All right, Mara.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask you if I can strip all of your very impressive titles away. Can you tell me and can you introduce yourself to the audience, talking just about what drives you, what your motivations are, what the intersection of your work is?
Wow, what a question. First of all, I have to say that I'm a huge fan of the Public Lab.
Oh, thank you.
And in fact, if I have to say what drives me, well, the Public Lab's work has been a huge inspiration for my work.
Thanks, I appreciate it.
Possibly the same things, trying to, I don't know, find some sort of truth in things and reveal it through any means that, that I have. A lot of my work is influenced by the fact that I used to be a journalist. And as a journalist, much of your day-to-day work or what you do is try to find stories and try to bring them to the surface, right? And I feel like, although now what I do is a lot more scientific or technological, I'm still doing the same. And the stories that catch my attention are those of people who have been struggling for something that is unfair. And through data, we can help them collect evidence to fight for a cause. It can be something really small, or it can be big, but it's basically that sort of thing that drives me, really.
Great. In an era where a lot of the conversation in journalism, and I know this is a past life of yours, is about how we address misinformation. And we're here talking about how people can do their own environmental monitoring and engage in community-driven projects through citizen science. Can you talk just a bit about how you see that fitting in with the more kind of formalized structures of journalism and storytelling?
That's such an important question, and I've been struggling with that a lot because there have always been fake news, always. There's always been gossip and fake news and contradicting versions of things, and then you retrieve to science because you think that science with its methods and its tools is going to help you move away from all that, and then you figure out when in science as well they are contradicting theories and interests and power structures and so on, and you also see that the truth is a tricky one. It's a complex matter. And of course, what happens is that before, we would have a few agents with a lot of power that could stream information for a lot of people. And now you have, and you had fake news, and you had lies. And now you have a lot more people streaming a lot more information to a wider audience. So of course, what happens? You have more lies, more fake news.
Right.
But in a complete different order of magnitude. And the problem is that because of the speed of technology and the lowering costs of it, this is happening at a greater speed and at a greater scale. And obviously, this is, to control this, is so borderline with freedom of speech. You have to be so careful that I still haven't seen any viable solutions to the problem of controlling fake information. Now, listen to this. We were yesterday with Rosa and Nora and also other colleagues in the citizen science community. We were launching this new project called Cities Health. And as we were describing the project, which is about collecting data, people collecting data about the impacts, the health impacts of environmental data. So what we're going into a hardcore dimension of privacy and so on, because one type of citizen science is collecting air quality data, another one is when you now start collecting health data, right? And so the commissioner from the European Commission started talking about fake news and so on in the lunch talk. And then I realized, of course, what is going to happen as well is that we are, through these projects and so on, like the work of the Public Lab, we are opening up the recipes for anybody to do science in a do-it-yourself fashion. And this obviously means that anybody can take up these tools for any purposes. And as these tools become more and more broadly available and sometimes even certified and so on, we will have fake scientific studies. And the problem is going to be bigger. We're still trying to figure out how to deal with fake news. Imagine when we have fake science.
So this rolls very nicely into my next question. In reading a bit about you, I think it was striking to see your interest in data governance, so many times mentioned, and also in bottom-up civic engagement. So can you talk about the combination of two and how they fit and kind of what you see the future of their intersection as?
Yeah. So to me, I realized very quickly working in citizen science, and I started working in citizen sensing, so with the Internet of Things and sensors and so on. And very quickly I realized that we were working with people, coming together as communities to gather data and so on, thinking that this data was saying something about a problem that we wanted to solve, right? And then very quickly we realized that this data was also saying a lot about the person who was collecting the data. Say we want to tackle the problem of noise pollution, and therefore we put noise sensor in our window sills. And then you realize, like it's happened a few times in my work, that you scream a lot to your children. And this data I had this situation of a lady coming to my office and saying, look, I don't want to have this sensor anymore. Why? Because I scream too much to my children, and now everybody can see this because the data is being opened. So we're trying to solve a problem of urban noise pollution, and now we have a domestic problem where the kids are bullying their mom because she was telling them all the time how noisy they were, and by looking at the data, they figured out she was noisier than them. And so obviously this leads to, I'm putting a very mild example that helps illustrate the thing, but imagine you have a sensor, a noise sensor in your windowsill in your bedroom. And obviously you do things, and these things make noise, and this data is out there. So obviously data is not just some neutral thing. It's not just numbers. When you put these numbers on a map, and when you open up these numbers, they say so much about you. So there is a massive pressure for us, all of us working in citizen science, to address the ethics, the ethical challenges surrounding data collection and data sharing, and to really think about data governance. Who owns that data? And what are the legal and the technological and social tools that we can put together so that we protect people, so that they can contribute this data without exposing themselves? Not to say, you know, we have obvious scandals like Cambridge Analytica and so on for the amount of data that we're producing all the time and releasing into the void, and some others are using. So my work on data governance, first of all, is about understanding what is the perception of people regarding the data privacy, data security, and under which conditions they are willing to share this data. What is the balance between addressing an issue that affects me and revealing something about myself that could cause me more problems? And then figuring out different devices, social, technical, legal, to enable data governance.
So let's talk about one of those. I think you told me that you've been working on or have already launched a license that is for data to the common good. Can you talk, I'd love to hear more about the license specifically, but also just the process that led you to thinking of this as a solution.
So I think there are two approaches nowadays, and some people here, like Pablo, for example, are super experts, so correct me if I say something stupid. I would say that nowadays there are like two big approaches to data governance. One is that is kind of very situated and is like what we're trying to do in the Decode project, for example, where we decide that we're going to produce data with a sensor. Say all of us are going to have a noise sensor at home, right? And together we decide under which combinations of conditions we're willing to share that data. For example, if it's open, it has to be aggregated and anonymized. If it's not anonymized, then it's only for us to see. And if it's going to be for research purposes, for a public institution, then they can have all the data. And so those combinations are recorded into something that we call a dynamic entitlement. Let's say like a little contract that self-executes itself. So when you install your sensor, you can say, okay, this data that I'm going to produce with my sensor can be shared under these conditions, and this condition, and this condition. And this creates a framework where you have a chance to manage and control your data in accordance with the community. Now, this approach is a little bit hard to scale nowadays. We can say that nowadays it's hard to scale, right? So another approach that could be complementary to this is to come up a priori with an understanding of under which conditions all of us would be willing to share data and write a license like Creative Commons, right? And make that license legally binding. So how do we do that? And then anybody can use that license. And in fact, we are going to present the license in 2 weeks at the Mobile World Congress. And our idea is that any company, researcher, or citizen can use that license to share the data. And how did we come up with this license? Well, we followed a bottom-up approach where we did a number of workshops with people. And now the license is only for health data, which is one of the most tricky ones, I would say.
Yeah.
And so we ran a number of co-creation workshops to try and understand how people feel about data and privacy and under which conditions they feel comfortable sharing their data. And oh my, that was amazing. And a funny one, people are more willing to share their DNA data than their social media and browsing data. And I'm like, but you're giving away your browsing data and your Facebook data every time, every day. But you know, there are these really interesting tensions. So after running all these co-creation workshops, testing different scenarios, we identified the 5 key variables. The 5 key variables that are relevant for people making a decision. And so we created an online tool called Triam that randomly combines these variables in scenarios and presents the user with different scenarios. For example, a university is asking you for your DNA data to produce, to investigate chronic disease, and the output of the research is going to be open source. It presents all these scenarios. We have 8,000 validations of these scenarios, and what it shows in the backend, when you mine the data, you can see what is a combination of variables that produces a situation where people are more likely to share. You know what that is? Because I know I'm in my last minute, so it's a good moment to... People are 87% of the people we surveyed are willing to share the data if it is to a public institution, if it's going to be used to investigate chronic or rare disease, so not other important stuff, let's say, if they can, if some strong level of anonymization is provided, and if the result is going to be open. Openness in the result was the key element in making people reach a decision. And the last one is that at any time you can change your mind and retrieve the data. So that is the new Salus Common Good data sharing license that we're presenting next week.
That's great. Can I have one more question? Okay. In the moment that we're at, and with technology, not seeing a slowdown in the production of it, that's going to continue altering our data landscapes. Can you reflect on one thing that you want to see changed from where we're at now to what the future looks like, or give your future vision for what our governance of data looks like.
I like to see, to me, one of the most disturbing things, and to make it really short because I could talk forever, as you can see. To me, one of the most complicated problems is that all our data landscape is dominated by 4 big companies. 3 big companies, Amazon, Facebook, and Google. And that's a huge problem. That's completely irresponsible and completely problematic. So to me, the only viable future is a future where the technology ecosystem is much more distributed, with more agents, and obviously where you have strong legislation. Legislation is not a stopper to innovation. We don't want Mark Zuckerberg apologizing in Parliament after he did whatever he wanted for 10 years with our data. We don't want another Cambridge Analytica. We want strong, accountable institutions that can regulate technology that's there for the common good. That will be a future that rocks.
Thank you.
Thank you. It is amazing to have Leanne on stage again.
Well, thank you.
So have you been enjoying this conversation so far?
I have. I've learned, actually, I've learned a lot today.
Yeah.
And the differences between what we go through in the U.S. fighting, against the government to encompass the citizen science work, and here it's like it's totally supported by your government in most cases, where they help you and they're aiding you in your work, and I think that's just fantastic. I hope we can get the United States to that level.
There are a lot of things that are better in Barcelona than in the US right now. For example, we believe in climate change here. So I'm really, really happy that I have you here, and I can ask you this question. I will first ask a question, and then I will try to flesh it out a bit. How to go from data to action. So in citizen science, we have so many projects that are all about collecting the data. And then citizens don't really know what happens after that data has been collected, because it goes into scientists' black boxes, turns into a paper, and citizens hardly ever hear anything back from that. Whereas in your case, there's a clear situation where data has been collected on a physical thing, water, and it has led to amazing change. I mean, it has gone all the way up to the Justice Department and so on. So how do you go from data to action? What are the things, the drivers, the actions that turn data sets into tangible change?
Well, that would be, I was lucky enough to partner with the professor that I did. And actually, I stumbled upon him somewhat on accident when I was looking to see about children with lead in drinking water who have been poisoned. He was the only person I could find online, Mark Edwards from Virginia Tech, that had ever done any kind of work on that. And so I was working with an EPA official, Miguel del Toro, and I had mentioned to him, hey, I think I'm going to reach out to this professor to see if I can get him to help. And I told him his name, and that's when I found out that Mark was actually doing independent sampling. So when the EPA collects your data, they have to send it out for an independent to verify. And so Mark already had my samples. And so I reached out to him, and we started collaborating. And we got to go from data to action because it was such a health crisis. It was so much more important to him and his team of students that were working behind the scenes from the citizen science work that we were doing in our community to make sure it was out there. Our lives were more important than the paper, more important than the credit. It was more important to make sure this was being addressed as loudly publicly as possible to make sure we could reach all the residents to let them know this is real. Here is, we the citizens did the work. We safeguarded our work with the protocols my husband put into place to make sure they couldn't throw our work out. but here is the professor that analyzed the samples that we collected, and he's saying there's a problem. And so luckily, the professor that I work with, Mark, that was more important to him, making sure, him and his students, making sure we got that information out for everybody. And they were actually blown away when we did all that, and we did our press conference. He let the citizens take the lead on it. He was there, him and his, some parts of his team were there with us when we did it. But it was more important for us to get the credit, the residents, to him, because we put in the 3 weeks and the countless hours of the foot traffic going door to door, getting, handing samples out and getting samples back.
So this is exciting. I want to capture this moment where you have a hunch as a citizen, there are health problems in your community, or you have a hunch. And then you collect your data, you test it, but then you have the confirmation from the scientist. No, this is true. What happens after that? What do you do? What were you doing, by the way, that moment? Were you at home? What do you do next time? How do you, because a lot of people here really want to know, probably, they have a similar problem with air quality and something, but sometimes it can be paralyzing to know that you have this data in your hands. And it says so much. So how do you do it? You call a conference, you mobilize people?
You try to be as loud about it as possible. I mean, for instance, when I was working with the gentleman from the EPA, and he was letting me use him as a mentor, he had timelined out everything. And then handed that over to the EPA. And he was actually trying to be able to come do testing, and the EPA wouldn't let him come do what we did as citizens prior. This was in June of 2014. And all I did was simply ask a question. Can I have what you've put together because it's my information? And he said yes. And seeing that in black and white, and knowing that I could prove with that paper that this wasn't just the paper, even before the science work, that it wasn't specific to my home, like the city kept telling everybody, it was surreal. Because I'm living it every day, and I kind of had to take a step back and take it in, because it's different reading your life in black and white and seeing everything you've been through in the last 6 months, and you're still standing. And he got in a lot of trouble for that, too. I mean, he almost got fired because I had that piece of paper, and I handed it over to media, one of the only media sources that was working with us, which was the ACLU, and they did the story on it from the documents that I provided. And that's when the city and the state really, and now federal, and at this point federal government, really started clamping down on what we were doing. And so that's why when we did the citizen testing, that's why it was so important, because to my husband, to my family, with everything that we had been going through, if we couldn't prove with that testing that this is what was happening, there wasn't any other place to go after this.
Hearing from Medium on how people are using social media in the city to tell a version of their city and their problems and so on, I wonder if this social media was relevant to you in spreading the word, whether there are any pros and cons of social media in that context?
Oh, yes. The pros of it is trying to get the word out. It's being able to gather people a little bit faster in some cases. You really still have to get out there and do the door-to-door with the older community because they're not on a social media platform. And so that's been very, very helpful, getting information back and forth to each other. It works out well that way, getting it out beyond your city, beyond your state. It's been helpful that way. The drawbacks to social media are when you're working in these collective groups and people, I go by the science. To me, science is truth. And I may not like what the science is saying at times, but it's still the truth. And so when you're putting that out there and you're getting backlash from other residents because they don't like the fact that we're moving forward, even if it's small baby steps like it has been, that's a problem. When, I'm going to use Mark Edwards, the professor, as an example, he was doing a health panel, and he had actually done a presentation, and in it he had quoted a CDC study, their data, to show that Flint residents had changed their bathing habits. And because people didn't like that he was saying, things were improving minus, this, they twisted what he said, and people are saying, oh, well, he's saying we're dumb and we're stupid and we're dirty because he's saying we don't bathe.
Oh.
And that's not what was being said. He quoted an actual study to show what the changes had occurred in Flint. So as going forward, if there is a water problem, how to prevent something like that. And that's where social media came back to backfire.
But I don't understand how. I mean, like, you're living in Flint, and you're drinking water from the tap, and that water is basically poisonous. Who would complain about this? Who would not support this? How can there be residents? I mean, like, were they really residents?
Oh, yeah. When we first started working in it, I had told a story earlier where me and my kids were canvassing, and I had some guy who was cursing and screaming at me in front of my children before it was a crisis, telling me that I was crazy and I was stupid. And my kids wanted to quit doing what we were doing, and I used that as a teachable moment to tell my kids that you can't let someone silence your voice when you know you're right about something. I'm a very big gut person. When I don't follow my gut, that's when it comes back to bite me. So I stick with that motto now.
But do you know what I mean, like, because that happens all the time, I mean, like, there's always going to be people who support your cause and people who don't. But in this case where it's so obvious that it's a public problem. It's so hard to believe, that.
Well, I mean, and that's where the citizen scientists came in and saved what we were doing. We were teaching, I was teaching myself, other residents were teaching themselves in different areas. I was teaching myself in the water, but we didn't have scientific data to back it up. And so to these people, the city of Flint and the state of Michigan, who are paid to protect us, are saying that everything's fine, the water quality is great, there's nothing wrong. Are you, believe the people who are getting paid? Or are you believing these residents over here who are causing a ruckus because they're self-taught? And so that's why when we did the citizen sampling that we did to prove that it was a citywide problem, that's where we had our aha.
Yes.
And that's when the residents that were against what we were working on actually, came back and apologized. I can't tell you how many Facebook groups I was blocked from when I was trying to spread the word before it was a crisis, because there was that lack of support because of those reasons.
So what is next? What is it that you're going to channel your energy?
I have my energy going in too many places. I'm just going to say that. I have a hard time saying no, especially for a good cause. Well, I'm leading the citizens in the chlorine testing in the city. With that, we're going to have to fight for policy change on how the city is testing the water for chlorine, because we've had too many people with bacterial issues. So that's one of it. The other thing is making sure we get the federal law changed with the lead and copper rule, which is the rule that's in place to protect us, that people are allowed to cheat with loopholes, and that's okay. And they've known about this for 15 years. This is why it needs to change. Even though there was a crisis in Flint, and everybody knows there was a crisis in Flint, Flint has never, ever, to this day, been given a violation for that federal rule that's in place because of the cheating methods that are not illegal.
Wow.
So how do you become a federal emergency and you haven't even been penalized by the federal government?
Really?
Yes, absolutely. One of the other things that I've been working on is I'm part of what's called the U.S. Water Study. And so we had so many people getting a hold of us about water quality issues in other rural communities, wanting to have their water tested. And so with still working with Virginia Tech, we're partnering with them. We've actually gone in and tested in other cities. People have, we've had donations come in where we've been able to go in and help test in other places. I was just in Denmark, South Carolina, right before I came here, because they'd been fighting a problem for the last 10 years. And it wasn't until we went into there and there was testing getting done, and I talked to them about the testing methods that we used, and they got to do it. they were actually finally able to, say, hey, look, there is this problem. This is what's causing all of our health issues, and we were able to prove that. And so that's one of the things that we are working on, is trying to get into these other communities that are reaching out to us.
That's very amazing. I know I ran out of time, but I think all of you and myself, we are wondering, have you tried Barcelona water?
No. I hate to say it like this, but you can't call it. Do you guys know what PTSD is? Post-traumatic stress disorder. You have to take the post off of that for Flint because of the lack of trust from the government. People can't bring themselves to drink the water from the tap, even though there has been improvements.
Wow.
And I'm a trust person, and I trust the science on what's showing where the lead levels have come down. But the emotional part of me,
no tap water for you.
I cannot do tap water. My children, my 7-year-olds are activists. They try to educate other children about water. And and they educate their dentist. No, I can't have that. Where's my bottled water? I mean, it's not the best solution, but it's what we can live with right now after what's happened.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Leon.
Thank you.
Okay, so the good thing now is that you get to ask the questions, right? So I have been asked to moderate this a little bit. We have all the speakers. Shall I do this in Spanish or English? People can ask, you can ask, vosotros podéis preguntar en catalán o en castellano o en inglés, y yo haré un esfuerzo para traducir a mis compañeras, y Miriam me va a ayudar también. Thank you.
They're moving everything.
Okay, shall we help here? ¿Preguntas? Sí, dinos tu nombre antes. Casper. Ah. Yeah, they are recording.
Then a question. Maybe you can pick up this comment and comment yourself on what you think about this, because a couple of things you were talking in this last dialogue. First, you mentioned the risk of coming up with the idea of fake science, and I think it already exists. It's called pseudoscience, and all the science that is not reproducible with the scientific method, that fails to pass through the self-control of the scientific community. So picking up this preoccupation, maybe I think you missed one point, one step, because you asked, how do you get from the data to the action? So there is one step, is the analysis of the data, because with data you still don't have the evidence, you don't have truth. Leanne, you also told you trust the truth of the scientists, which is good, but and your story is also a great example of this, because this citizen science project, getting the community to involved in the process of really creating scientific results, is a great example of the possibility to bring science to the community, to the society, and to teach them the scientific method. So this step of understanding, how do you actually get the data into a result that you can rely on as scientific fact, that you can use as evidence, as truth, to take action based on this evidence that you can use as an argument. I think this gives power to the people. So I think that, and that's actually the thing I wanted to comment, that maybe in this step is something we should put a lot of emphasis, so that the people start to understand the power of the science, that they can empower themselves participating in this whole process, and there is actually self-control of the scientific community that grants the quality of the results, that you cannot just present a fake science article saying, okay, this water is bad, but you need to have the backing of the scientific community, and so the authority of the truth is distributed to the community.
To answer your question, remember earlier, I mean, I touched base about this a little bit earlier today. Because of all the resistance we had gotten from the city, the state, and then the federal government, I don't want to downplay that, because when the city wasn't helping us, and then the state wasn't helping us, and then we finally had the federal government helping us, that was fantastic. And then when federal government decided they were no longer going to help us, but go against us, where do you turn? And so that's what led us to do what we did. But because of all the resistance, that's why it was so important that, you know, my husband, being the military man that he is, and the protocols he put into place to make sure they could not throw out our results. That's how we got it to stick, because we could prove that only the homeowner and only the people who were analyzing these samples had actually touched these samples with the protocols we put into place. And so taking that when that was done, and having the professor put all the data together for us, him and his students, we were able to have that for us. So making sure you protect your work, you know, do like a think tank kind of a thing. We sat back and said, okay, what are the ways that are going to try and discredit the work that we're doing because we're just citizens? And you know, everybody sat around and we talked about it, and then we implemented ways to make sure that couldn't happen. So that would be the most important part of going forward with the work.
I just want to add one thing. So I think a lot of us are using science to support our organizing, our community organizing activities. So sometimes we don't actually need new data or different types of data. We have to think about data that's appropriate for our initial goals. And a lot of this kind of work doesn't go from collecting one set of information to legislation or to litigation. It's a snowball. So I may take an image with my camera, or I may go out and interview and get qualitative narratives from a number of my neighbors, and that leads to a media story. So I think we have to be also very open that it's not just about like the hard science at every step and getting the backing of scientists. It's also thinking about where data and information has different roles to play.
I really think, sorry, but I think my question to her was misunderstood, because of course I know the data needs to be analyzed. But let me say here, and I strongly believe this, which might be a very controversial comment, I don't think evidence produces action. Unfortunately, the world is full of evidence that the emissions from cars are killing us, and yet our cities are packed with cars, that sugar is really bad for us, and you turn around, you want to eat something, and it's all packed with sugar. So really, to me, evidence doesn't necessarily translate into tangible change. And that's where the strength from a community allows you to pave the way for change, because unfortunately, public opinion changes public policy, sometimes more than evidence. So that was the direction of my comment.
I also wanted to add something about science, because I think an underlying assumption in maybe your comment and just in general, all what we've been talking about, is the question of hard data, numbers, quantitative science, you know, the types of positivist science. And at the end of the day, this is what gets published in public health, for instance, you know, going back, for instance, to how what amount of lead in water creates which types of health outcomes. But I think that there is also a role that we haven't talked too much about today, which is qualitative research, which is not going to, I think, produce the same type of output that maybe some super high-level journals are looking for, but they are going to qualitative research like interviews, observation, deep ethnography, uncovers trends or uncovers new drivers in social impacts that you had never thought about before, and that is unfortunately undervalued in science. And we are qualitative researchers, I think a lot of us in our lab. And for instance, now we're looking at the impact of gentrification and displacement on health. Most health studies are looking at data collected in other contexts than gentrification and still trying to do assumptions about, okay, gentrification has impacts on anxiety. But what we are looking at here is looking at testimonies and interviews with health workers, community organizations, directors of schools, families, a broad array of stakeholders of people who are living through displacement, and they are telling us this is also what we are living with. This is what our patients are reporting, this is what our families are experiencing, and that creates an understanding of what gentrification means for health. But that's going to be discredited in a scientific journal that has the highest impact factors that sometimes researchers need. So we're also trying, I think, as scientists, to question what types of science is valued out there, even for promotion or just for a job, because at the end of the day, we respond not to publications, but to the people and to the policies we want to affect. And that's, at the end of the day, ultimately who we want to have as a constituency.
So I have been asked to get us all out of the room by 8, and it's 8:10. So I'm just going to say, I'm sorry, because I'm not sure whether there are any other burning questions, but if maybe we can take one more question, and for Miriam and Louise, who didn't get to speak, they can answer. Sorry. Yeah? Here? Sorry, Casper. We'll catch you outside, Casper. Sorry.
Yes. Okay, thank you. My name is Manuel. How could I put it in words? Okay, we have been talking about fake news and climate change denials and probably fake science, I would say. By the other side, we talked about a lot of citizen engagement with the government and engagement with other stakeholders. But few words have been said, or I think fewer, about engaging news corporation, newspaper, or different alternatives also, ways of communicating what communities are doing, or projects like yours are doing to engage them, to tell the stories to the general public and make it maybe in a first stage of the agenda. Right?
Thank you.
Okay. Yes, when we talk about engaging corporations, because news corporations, because we believe in them as the main source of information in the world and the one that we consume and that at the end of the day is moving the opinions. I attended a conference by Jean-Paul Martos a few months ago, and it was also about fake news and prejudices and everything, and he said that news corporations will only be changed by the law or by the market. And I think that we as citizens are not the law, but we are the market, and in that we do have a say. And it also depends on how we consume. So if we do engage citizens and we engage public institutions in knowing more about how these whole digital communications can help us to find new ways to communicate, to create our own platforms, to be able to just raise our voice when something does not sound right, or just sometimes it's even an image that you know that does not bring the right context to the news. I think that we can say it, and by saying it, we may be able to change the news corporations. And of course, we've had conversations with media, we've had conversations with journalists, speaking as journalists, not as citizens or whatever other role they may have in society. And of course, it's an interest that they have to have better reputation when it comes to giving the news. But then there's also clickbait, and then there's also the importance of Google Analytics and having a lot of views in your page and having this article read, and maybe hiring influencers and not journalists to write your post just because you want more views. So yes, they are concerned, and they have been engaged in a lot of conversations, and they play a very important role. But there's also other aspects that affect how they make decisions. And one of those aspects that affect how they make decisions is whether citizens are more aware or not on what's happening. So to me, working in social media and data analysis has changed the way I consume information. 2 or 3 years ago, I would just turn on the TV and be like, whatever channel's on, I will watch the news. Today, I don't do that anymore. Even if I know that it's the coverage on the same information, I just know that I don't want to give more power, even if it's, I mean, I'm one in 40 million. But I know to which spaces I want to give more power, what I want to consume, who I want to read, because I know that I want more like that, not because that's the only good one. So yes, they are important, they've been engaged, but we can change them. So.
Okay, I'll keep it short. Everyone wants to go
Oh,
home.
sorry,
No,
I forgot.
No, I'm just saying, I mean, I would kind of echo Miriam's sentiment in regards to there are a number of different factors that influence whether something goes and makes it in the news or not. I would say that we have tried on many times to engage local press, national press, on some of the programs we're working on. And that success is sometimes determined by riding that waves. So at the moment, air quality is in the news. It's a hot topic. So if we kind of attack them at that moment, yeah, we're riding that crest of the wave. That's not to say it's not important at other times, but it's just, okay, their thematic domain this month, this year, we have Volkswagen Gate, so it fits with their narrative and their motivations. So I think it's using them to promote and encourage what we're doing within our spheres and domains is great, but it's sometimes as much a barrier because right now that's not their agenda. And what you're doing is fine, but actually we're more interested in focusing on, I don't know, something else. So I think many times it's not about us not wanting to engage, it's just about, okay, what's the priority or what's the kind of hot topic at the moment, and are you fitting within that framework?
Thank you very much. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.